All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started for the afternoon session, and it is my pleasure to get to introduce Dr. John Lewin for this first afternoon session. John was the first clinical specialist pharmacist in the NCCU that was dedicated to us, and he came in 2004. And actually, ironically, we both came from the University of Maryland. I had been working there for a little over a year as an NP, and John had been working there as well. We didn't know each other there, but then we ended up starting back at Hopkins at the same time. He is currently the Chief Medical Officer at On Demand Pharmaceuticals, and we are still lucky to have him come back to the NCCU from time to time. He's an associate professor in anesthesia and critical care medicine. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce John.
Thank you, Betsy. It means a lot to be introduced by Betsy because, as she had said, when I got here in 2004 and Betsy was starting as the clinical nurse specialist, we had to figure out a lot of new things together. And so thank you, Betsy, for that. Thanks for being such an amazing partner all of these years. It's really a pleasure, and I'm humbled to be here speaking along with all the other speakers about what could be the future of pharmacotherapy for neurocritical care. But as I go through my presentation and do that, as others have done, I do want to reflect on some of the history and the achievements that we've achieved together, because as we've built out our pharmacy capabilities, again, it's been part of that original ethos of it's the team, it's the neurocritical care team. And it was really an honor and a pleasure, and I learned a ton from everybody here as I had the opportunity to grow into the neurocritical care discipline. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history, hospital pharmacy and how it's evolved, because I think it does help us project into the future. And then I'll provide a bit of a summary of Hopkins Neurocritical Care Pharmacy and what we've achieved broadly with the entire team's help, and then try to project a bit into 2062. I'll layer on some of what Robert talked about earlier and Betsy, and how that might impact the way we approach using drug therapies to enhance our patients' lives. So a little bit of history. These are pictures of the original apothecary at Johns Hopkins, or the apothecary building. As most pharmacies, it was located in the basement at the time. And actually, most pharmacies are still located in the basements in hospitals all across the country, including here we have one. However, nowadays at Johns Hopkins, where we had one person in the apothecary, or one pharmacist potentially, or physician and others, manufacturing medicines, today we have about a 400-person department with 200 pharmacists and 5 inpatient pharmacies, and that's not counting the rest of the retail environments across the health system. So pharmacies come a long way since the original building of this building and this environment that you see here, where medicines were initially manufactured for patients as needed. So a little bit of the evolution of hospital pharmacy. So in the 1700s, pharmacists have been associated with hospitals ever since there were hospitals here in the U.S. And in 1752, a guy by the name of Jonathan Roberts was the first paid apothecary at Pennsylvania Hospital, which was the first hospital in colonial America. He also was an apprentice physician at the time. So physicians were sort of doing both duties. You were making the drugs, prescribing the drugs, giving the drugs, and essentially his protege, John Morgan, was first a pharmacist, also went on to train to be a physician. It was really one of the first people to advocate that, one, we should have written prescriptions for our patients as opposed to just making it and giving it, and two, it might be a good idea to diverge the professions and develop those expertise for our patients over time. In the 1800s, we had the Civil War, and out of all of our wars have come tons of different medical innovations. Anesthesia, for example, was born out of the Civil War. And in this case, in the Civil War, essentially, pharmacists were sought out for their experience in spur-of-the-moment manufacturing of medicines. They had so many injured folks, they needed folks to make medicines immediately at the point of care. And I sort of want to plant that seed in your mind, because I'm going to come back to that when we talk about on-demand pharmacotherapy of the future. As we progress in the early 1900s, a few things happened. One was prohibition. And physicians needed alcohol to prescribe for a lot of their medicines. So you sort of needed somebody to keep track of the inventory because it was hard to come by and hard to manufacture. Pharmacists did a lot of that activity, and that's when you started to see I think it was the 1906 Food and Drug Act, which was essentially the beginnings of the FDA, and folks really started paying attention to the quality of medicines. This is where you started to see the first formularies being born in places like Hopkins and others saying, maybe we shouldn't allow these things that have mercury in them on our formulary, for example. Going into the late 1900s, you then saw hospital pharmacies then begin to do things like prepare sterile injectable medicines in bulk in order to supply their patients. So you had many manufacturing plants essentially on site in places like this as part of the apothecary. We started providing bulk materials to nurses and nursing units on the floor. And in the late 1900s, pharmacy started to evolve to do a few things, essentially provide unit dose medicines ready to use. That began in the late 1900s. And then the pharmacy profession started to see a shift. As you started to see commercial manufacturing produce medicines in bulk, there were big conferences amongst the pharmacy profession where we said, hey, we need to think about this a little bit differently. We need to think about how we are not just associated with getting medicines from point A to point B, but how do we use our knowledge to optimize medication-related outcomes? And in the 1980s, 1990s, you started to see a number of innovative places like the Neurocritical Care Unit here at Johns Hopkins in the late 80s start to have pharmacists on rounds. I called a few of them that started here before I did. Some of you may remember Pharmars and Suan, for example, that they would come in early on their own because it wasn't really part of their job just to read about the patients so they could maybe contribute something on rounds. I talked to Pharmars and he provided some reflections for those of you that might remember. And he felt like in the beginning it was a little uncomfortable because you were kind of this kind of like a medical student on the periphery, like standing outside and looking in. And then after a period of time, the next thing you knew, he felt like the knowledge that he had and his lens of looking at the patient through the medication regimen became very valuable to that interdisciplinary team. So you saw places like Hopkins and many others start to begin to implement and include that pharmacist individual as part of that integrated member of that care team to leverage their knowledge to increase patient outcomes. And of course, today, now we have fully integrated team members, we have society guidelines and others that include, essentially prescribe as multidisciplinary care, the best way to go about this. And when it comes to medicine production, we have a lot of advanced robotics now in our pharmacies. If you all ever go to the oncology pharmacy upstairs, you'll see 2 IV compounding robotic arms that provide chemotherapy for our patients' infusions. There's lots of other technologies coming our way in the future, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we go through this discussion. But a lot's been achieved in terms of interdisciplinary patient care, and many of you in the neurocritical care team have really helped make this happen. When I came here in 2004, I was talking to Mark a little bit earlier, who is one of my most important mentors in my life. I was at shock trauma. I was over there for 2 years in the neurointensive care unit, and when I came to interview here, I interviewed with the pharmacy department, and I said, am I going to get to meet the medical director of the unit? And they said, well, yeah, but he wasn't available on the day you interviewed. So Mark called me in between cases when he was in the OR, and we had a short interview. And the thing that I took away from that with Mark's discussion was essentially, yeah, I'm not sure what to expect, but I'm going to support you in how we're going to integrate you in the team. And I thought, what an amazing opportunity. I'm going to be dedicated to this ICU. I'm going to have the opportunity to learn from brilliant nurses, brilliant physicians, day in, day out, and I'm going to get to incorporate my patient care capabilities with teaching and education as part of the tripartite mission here. And so for me, that's what started in 2004, building off of the backs of folks like Pharmars, Suan, and a few others. And then in 2009, I moved on to a leadership position as a director of the critical care and surgery pharmacy. And we had Haley Gibbs, who many of you worked with for about 6 years. And now we have Dr. Farouk as our full-time clinical pharmacy specialist in the neurocritical care. But let me just highlight a few things. A number of folks presented these really nice trees, and I like that. I wish I had thought to do that. But in the time from 2000 to today, the Johns Hopkins Pharmacy Department, has grown tremendously in the clinical capabilities. We went from essentially no pharmacy residents to about 25 pharmacy residents, 2 PGY2 critical care residents, and from the critical care pharmacy residency programs and the PGY1 residents, we've had about a third of them have gone on to start dedicated neurocritical care pharmacy practices. And that's in part because of folks like Salia and Haley. But more importantly, it's part of that environment. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because the amazing environment that was created here at Hopkins, when fellows would leave and go to other places and they'd say, I don't have my pharmacist, they would call Haley or Sally and me and say, John, what do I got to do to put this in place? Okay, we didn't have the blue sheet, but we provided our mental blue sheet for them when they went off into these other places. So again, spreading those things across the country has happened organically, but it really began with that ethos of interdisciplinary care. We've had the opportunity to participate in education across disciplines, and I don't know if you know this, but the Neurocritical Care Unit, along with the SICU, with the support of folks like Adam Saperstein, Pam Lipset, and Mark Mursky, and Jose and others, was the first ICU in Maryland to grant prescribing privileges to pharmacists for things like renal dose monitoring, TPN writing, anticoagulation management, and all the things that you sort of trust in your pharmacist to do now, they're now able to do independently. So again, continuing to move things along and break barriers. And our pharmacist team have published over 100 publications and book chapters to be able to spread some of the great work that we've done. So where do we go next? Because there are new technologies coming our way, and how might this evolve? And I want to highlight a few. Many of these have been talked about already. Robert talked about wearables and gave some really amazing illustrations of how that can impact information that we can find out about our individual patients, because this is going to translate into individualized drug therapy. Things like digital organ simulation, Robert talked about that as well, or organ on a trip. These types of things are expected to advance drug development, potentially even allow us to devise a therapy that is customized to that individual patient for their needs in the moment. Nanorobots and advanced mechanisms for how we deliver drugs to different parts of the body. And of course, pharmacogenomics is already starting to inform how we dose medications based on an individual patient's pharmacogenomic makeup, whether they're fast metabolizer, slow metabolizer, and all kinds of other elements. Some of these are already coming out in the prescribing information for new drugs. And then, of course, we have cell therapies and gene therapies, which promise to entirely change the game, that allow for customized medicines made from your own cells. And of course, we have things like AI and big data analytics to help us harness all of that. Well, what does that mean? That means in 2062, we're going to have tons of different tools to be able to personalize our pharmacotherapy for our patients, and that is going to allow us to optimize medication-related outcomes. Our interdisciplinary teams are going to have the ability to do this in the future. However, going back to the Civil War, pharmacists were sought out for their experience in spur-of-the-moment making of a medicine for their patients. If we're going to have these individualized therapies, and they're going to be needed acutely for our patients, we're going to have to make them on-site. We're going to have to make them when we need them. We will have new platform technologies in the future that allow us to do this and make medicines at the point of care. We are working on this now at On Demand Pharmaceuticals. And just to give you a quick, brief history, Dr. Jeffrey Ling is the founding CEO of this organization. And Jeff talked about his time in Afghanistan. And I don't like giving Jeff's story about his time in Afghanistan because I don't deliver it nearly as well as he does. But the idea for this came directly out of a wartime need. He needed a drug for one of his TBI patients. He wanted to use bromocriptine to stabilize their dysautonomia. He couldn't get it. He knew if he was back here with me at Hopkins, would have had it to him immediately, but in the military, they couldn't get it. They had to fly it in from really far away to treat this patient, and that stuck with him. So Jeff had the innovative thinking and mindset and the ability to sort of see far ahead down the road to say, we need to develop a program around this so that we can make medicines anywhere we go on the planet. That's what started all of this back in 2013. That started what DARPA called their battlefield medicine program, and folks at MIT showed that it was possible. They developed some working prototypes of how we can synthesize molecules on demand in a small footprint in a highly automated system. Our company, ODP, is taking those systems from MIT and then has continued to advance them. So we have been the beneficiary from 2020, thankfully, of additional CARES Act funding in response to COVID. So essentially what happened was, while some of these programs were running in the background, when COVID occurred, I was getting phone calls from DARPA and our program manager saying, we get it. That all these hospitals are running out of sedatives and paralytics for COVID patients. Making medicines at the point of care sounds like a really good idea. How do we put this program on steroids? And so we were the benefactors of additional funding, and that really allowed us to explode the platform capabilities and our team's efforts to progress towards making medicines at the point of care. This is just an example of a prototype that was born at MIT that we refined that is essentially an entire Cipro manufacturing plant in just a few square feet. It synthesizes the active ingredients, it purifies it, and it turns those active ingredients into ciprofloxacin tablets. Why Cipro? That's a good target for DARPA and the DoD because it treats a lot of things that you can weaponize, right? We've since expanded those platforms greatly to expand the chemical reaction space, to expand the formulation space. So essentially, these are miniaturized systems that can do what is currently occurring across the entire globe. Fine chemicals, basically commodity chemicals, are harvested out of the ground from oil and agriculture, turned into fine chemicals, largely in China, and those fine chemicals and precursors are made into active ingredients, usually in India, and those active ingredients go all around the world to get formulated into tablets and injectables. That's the global supply chain for medicines today. We have done this in a small footprint, synthesized precursors, APIs, and formulated medicines in miniaturized devices like the ones that you see on the screen here. And we've now built out a GMP capability to use these systems and produce medicines that has resulted in our first FDA filing just a few weeks ago, which is very exciting. Now, where are we going next with this? We essentially are going to begin deploying these to hospitals. So this is what we call a shortage response pod. This is a miniaturized, small mobile clean room that will be outfitted with our capabilities. And it is designed to be essentially the world's first agile production capability. That's what's missing from our supply chain right now is agility. If you start running out of a shortage drug and you call all around, a manufacturer will say, well, yeah, I can start making it, but it won't be ready for a year. This will be the world's first agile response to drug shortages, and that's what we're looking to deploy first. But I want to be very clear. This is really in service of a much broader vision that Jeff started with way back in Afghanistan. This is in service of getting to distributed and point-of-care manufacturing. FDA is working with us on this. They have white papers out there, and they know this is the future. It's not just small molecules and shortages. There's plenty of other drugs where it just makes more sense to deliver at the point of care. If I got to take the blood out of your body and manipulate the cells and put it back into you, it's probably better done right there on site than shipping them all around the planet. So what does the future hold? I think the future holds something that looks like this: a network of platform technologies that allow us to produce medicines in a flexible, responsive, and resilient manner, and it allows us to scale these and clone these as we need in more volume. What are some of the value drivers for this? Again, what's missing is agility, and that's what we need for the future of precision medicine. We got to be able to make things when we need it, and we got to be able to make new things as soon as they're discovered for that individual patient. We're going to need stable pricing and transparency, safety and flexibility for things like rare and orphan diseases, pediatric doses, et cetera. So what does 2062 look like for us from neurocritical care pharmacotherapy on demand? It's still going to be that ethos of that interdisciplinary team. It's just that we're going to have a lot of new tools to play with. Lots of these abilities to essentially develop an individualized regimen for a patient and platform technologies to make it in real time when the patients need them. I like to think of it this way. It's a little bit of history repeating itself. So we're bringing the apothecary back to the pharmacy. Pharmacies are going to need to evolve to do this, to evolve to the future of the state of medicine for neurocritical care. So that's why I put a little machine here that's sitting on the desk of the apothecary at Hopkins. Apothecary essentially meant two things: distribute the medicines and I manufacture the medicines. Hospital pharmacies now distribute medicines and they optimize the medication therapy related outcomes for their patients with their clinicians' knowledge and capability as part of a multi-professional team. But the future will see us beginning to mold back in the manufacturing capability through these platform technologies. So I want to say thank you and happy 40th to the NCCU. And I couldn't thank everybody that's been influential over my career, because everybody that I've worked with has been amazing, but there's really two people that I want to call out. Mark, thank you for believing in me in 2004 when I started and giving me the support I needed to be successful amongst that interdisciplinary team. And Jeff, thank you for constantly pushing my boundaries in terms of what I was comfortable with and learning about. And so with that, I'll finish up. Thank you.